Panel. You probably know that the IWF has a reputation for putting on really great panels. Given the panel lineup tonight, the distinguished panelists, I think we might really have outdone ourselves, except we're still waiting for one, Lisa Schiffren, but we're going to start without her. We wanted to do this panel because at no time since the aftermath of World War II, when the middle class really came into its own, if people felt so insecure and anxious about getting into the middle class and staying in the middle class. As all of you know, the Obama administration has loved the middle class, loved it to death. And they got together a task force to figure out, how to rescue the middle class. Well, they did decide how. Guess what? They say more green jobs. That's green jobs. Maybe just jobs would help. Anyway, I think we'll probably come up with some different ideas here tonight. And without further ado, here is Sabrina Schaefer, our moderator and the executive director of the Independent Women's Forum.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight to Does the Middle Class Have a Future? I promise that we are going to have some optimistic, there's going to be some optimism here tonight. It's not going to be all down and dumb. But during an election year, we hear a lot about public opinion polls, and we often hear that the economy tops all other issues in terms of highest importance. And recently, the Pew Research Center found that 83% of voters pointed to the economy as, quote, very important to their choice of president in 2016. And in a separate survey that followed, they found that 73% of respondents who identify themselves as part of the middle class said the economy was the most important issue. And so when researchers dig down and ask specifically what this very broad term, the economy, means, voters usually point to jobs, income inequality, and rising prices, among other concerns that are sort of lower on the list. So it appears that the economy has become a proxy or a catch-all term for how people feel they're doing. And it's a reflection of their perception of affordability, of opportunity, of upward mobility. And this is all, of course, very personal. People think about the job or the raise that they did or maybe didn't receive, the cost of their grocery bill this week, the burden of buying a new car, the babysitter they have to pay for. But it also makes us ask, how do we define the middle class? When we ask people what social class they belong to, the overwhelming majority of us consider ourselves to be part of the middle class, the broad middle class. People might aspire to having more money, but when they think about, when they tell people publicly, well, I'm part of the middle class. And when Pew asked respondents this, earlier this year actually, 51% identify as solidly middle class, an additional 14% said they were upper middle class, and 22% said they were lower middle class. So altogether, 87% of the respondents identified themselves in that broad middle. Now, in reality, in 2014, a little more than half of Americans, 51%, truly lived in middle-income households. And in this particular survey, they defined that, there's different ways that we can define middle income, but they defined it as adults whose annual household income is 2/3 to double that of the national median after controlling for household size. So I'm a family of 5 versus someone who's single or has one child, so this varies. There's all sorts of ways. On the face of it, though, 51% of the country being in the middle class sounds pretty good. What's concerning, of course, is that the middle class seems to be losing ground, as Charlotte pointed out, and it's especially prominent in our metropolitan centers. The middle class seems to be shrinking to a point where it will no longer be the majority of the economic population. And so this then leads us to the question is being in the middle class simply a function of what's in your bank account? Or is it something less tangible? Is it more cultural in essence? Is it a Norman Rockwell fictional creation, a white family, a mother and a father with 2 children? We've all heard the expression, of course, that money doesn't buy class. So is being part of the middle class defined by our pocketbooks, or is it also our values, our aspirations, our goals? Is it about the way we speak, the food we eat, if we choose to exercise, or if we are able to go on a vacation, where we choose to go? Are all of these things factors in what social class we are part of? And where does one's perception of government fit into this discussion? Is being middle class today now associated with being part of this nation of takers, as Nick Eberstadt has talked about? 62% of Americans claim that government doesn't do enough to help the middle class. In fact, that's roughly the same share, 59%, that say government doesn't do enough to help the poor, which makes us wonder if we've begun to associate the middle class with struggle and with challenges. So what about those outside the Norman Rockwell portrait? Where do minorities fit into this picture of the American middle class? We know that there has been tremendous gains for African American families in America, but we also know that that growth tends to be less secure. So what does that mean? So before the panelists get started and start addressing some of these questions, I'll mention one last thought that I had when I was thinking about these remarks earlier in the week. A few days ago, my husband and I were watching HGTV. I don't know if any other women in here get addicted to that channel. I do. We were watching Love It or List It. It's become a little bit of a change channel. Anyway, the show, for those of you who are not familiar with Love It or List It, the show followed a couple who were living in a house that needed serious renovations. The couple decided to invest $75,000 into updating the house, while at the same time they go out with a realtor and they look at other potential properties. At the end of the show, if they don't love their newly renovated home, they can choose to list it at the new price post-renovations, in this case $450,000, and they can buy one of the homes that they found with this realtor. So in the end, the suspense, the couple chose to stay in the house. Yes, they loved it, and the $75,000 that they spent together improving it. But the real surprise came following this decision when the man got down on his knee and proposed to what was his girlfriend, who was his girlfriend. So, I didn't even sort of take note of this at first, and my husband was like, oh my God, they spent $450,000 on a house, but they're not even married? A nice, conservative Ohio boy. But I think it's worth exploring that we've become a society where it's completely normal to risk investing hundreds of thousands of dollars together, but not actually have made the commitment to be together in any kind of formal capacity. And so the question is, as a society, can we square the circle? Or is this a sign that the middle class is truly eroding and that this is a cultural phenomenon? So these are a few of the questions that I hope our panelists will tackle tonight in our quest to better understand the future of America's middle class. And I'm thrilled that we have now four fantastic speakers. They all have tremendously long and impressive resumes, so I will just touch on some of the highlights and you have fuller bios in front of you. But Charles Murray, who really needs no introduction at the end of the table, is the W.H. Brady Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, a political scientist, prolific author, and self-identified libertarian. Charles is perhaps best known for his critical publications Losing Ground, The Bell Curve, and more recently Coming Apart. He has his BA in history from Harvard, his PhD in political science from MIT. And he doesn't know this, but ever since I worked at AEI in 1999, I've wanted to meet him, so finally, here's my opportunity. Scott Winship, 2 over, is a visiting fellow with the newly formed Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity. Scott has been researching poverty, both the existence of it and its causes, so that we can have a better understanding of how to expand economic opportunity for more Americans. He's looked closely at issues like living standards, economic mobility, inequality, and security. He was previously the Walter B. Wriston Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, as well as a fellow at the Brookings Institution, a research manager of the Economic Mobility Project of the Pew Charitable Trust. He also holds his BA in Sociology and Urban Studies from Northwestern, PhD in Social Policy from Harvard. Welcome, Scott, to our first IWF panel with us, I think. And I'm very proud to say that Lisa Schiffren is one of IWF's senior fellows. Lisa is tremendously prolific. You have probably read her in National Review or in the Weekly Standard, but her career extends far beyond that. She started as an editorial writer for the Detroit News. But you may know Lisa. I don't like to say that you're best known, but you are well known for having been the speechwriter for Dan Quayle and writing the Murphy Brown speech, which obviously opened up lots of questions about gender roles and changes in our family structure and the welfare state, which we will talk about tonight. And finally, Carrie Lukas in purple. Carrie Lukas is IWF's managing director and my partner in crime at IWF. And it's interesting, this is the first time that Carrie and I have ever had the opportunity in person to work on a panel together. Carrie's been living overseas for almost a decade with her husband, who's a Foreign Service officer, so she brings a whole new perspective of social class structure to this conversation. She came from Wall Street originally to try to rescue her country from the claws of government, has been at the Cato Institute, as she has been on Capitol Hill at the Republican Study Committee, and she has been for a long time with the Independent Women's Forum. She writes all over the place. She has a book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Women, Sex, and Feminism, which you should all read, among many, 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 many other articles. So with that, I'll turn it over to Charles, and we'll start the conversation.
Okay. Now, you said that there wasn't going to be just doom and gloom, there's going to be some optimism here. That will be concentrated in the next 3 speakers. We're each going to give very brief overviews of some things we think are important in a period of about 5 minutes. I want to take 2 themes. Some of you have looked at the book Coming Apart. I show there trend lines and a whole series of graphs on a lot of important social and economic indicators for what I refer to as the upper middle class, consisting of people with college degrees and in a managerial position or in a profession or married to such a person. And I define the working class as people with no more than a high school diploma working in a blue-collar job or a service job, and everybody else in between, I didn't show trend lines for. And I think all those people in between include a great many of the people that we're referring to as the middle class. And what I showed in the book is that the upper middle class is actually doing quite well. On a lot of these trend lines, things were getting better. And for the working class, this is the white working class and the white upper middle class, things were going to hell. And the book got a lot of attention for that. Well, I got news for you. I've also plotted the lines for everybody else. And they were right in the middle in every single case, but they were all going the wrong way. Higher labor force dropout among males, a higher level of, a lower level of religiosity, lower, increasing criminality. Things were getting bad for them as well. And then when you look at the income distribution statistics and what has happened to them over the last 35, 40 years now, everybody is familiar with the assertion, which is correct, that the level of wages for people in the working class has remained essentially stagnant, whereas the incomes for people at the very top percentiles have gone up substantially. Well, they have gone up very little for that group in between as well. So, one possibility that we have to keep in mind is that what's going on in Fishtown, which is pretty catastrophic, is infiltrating into the middle class as well. That's the first non-optimistic theme. The second one has to do with the coming job market. I wouldn't be surprised if Scott does not curl his lip with what I'm going to say, but I think we are facing an unprecedented job situation over the next years. I know the Luddites have been wrong for 200 years about technology getting rid of jobs. I think, and I know how dangerous this is to say, this time is different. And the reason is not just that we now have 4 million people who make their livings driving cars and trucks who will not have those jobs, probably within 15 years, which is a really big bunch of people. And also, a lot of those income-wise fit into the middle class, because you can make good money driving rigs, long-distance rigs. It's not just that. It's what's happened with AI, artificial intelligence. AI has been overhyped for 30 years and has consistently failed to produce the wonders that it was supposed to produce. It is now catching up with the hype. There are a wide variety of jobs that now require above average intelligence and that pay good money. And the reason that they require above average intelligence and pay good money is because they involve making judgments, making choices with decision branches and decision trees which are not simple. And human beings who are reasonably smart were the only people who do those. A great many of those jobs are now going to be done equally well by software. Just a couple of examples here to give you a sense of what we're up against. You saw Watson on Jeopardy, okay, which was an information retrieval program, very impressive. Watson being the computer program produced by IBM that beat the champions. You know what Watson is doing now? Watson is diagnosing cancer and the appropriate treatments. And the thing is that Watson, when it makes those decisions, is drawing upon every single clinical trial that has been done, and about 150,000 of those are published every year. Very few doctors read 150,000 clinical trials every year and remember them all. And Watson now is basically a lot better at diagnosing cancer and prescribing a treatment than an ordinary practitioner. It's as good as an experienced oncologist, and up at Sloan Kettering, probably the premier, or at least the most famous place to treat cancer and diagnose cancer in the world, Watson is called a trusted colleague. And there are a variety of diagnoses that Watson has made correctly that have been missed by the humans. The other is what happened, and this is in many ways more pretentious. Got to finish this up. And that is, earlier this year, a computer beat one of the leading Go champions, Go being the Oriental game that is much more complicated than chess, much less susceptible to if-then logic. It had previously been thought it would be 10 years before there was a program that could beat a good Go player. It happened last spring, but here's the scary part. It was not software that had been created to play Go. It was software that had been trained to learn things. And so they fed it tens of thousands of past Go games, and the machine played against itself millions of times and taught itself to be better than one of the best players in the world. There are lots of different applications to that kind of ability to learn. So you have, in the middle class, you are going to have huge chunks of jobs that disappear. Okay, I guess that's enough cheerios. Down the line.
Lisa, I think we're going to have you go. I'm going to box better people. Are you sure? Okay, well, I was preparing to bat cleanup and to see what other folks had talked about, but I'll just touch on a few things that I think are worth considering. And we've, Sabrina kind of set up that there's both an economic component to what's going on with the middle class, and then kind of a cultural one. And while I know that there's going to be some talk about so that not everything's going downhill in terms of wages, when you look at kind of those key facets of the middle class, things like college education and housing, the rate of increases for the costs of these are so outstripping wage growth that they are becoming increasingly unaffordable and creating real barriers to that, both that sense of the actual aspiration, but then also the feeling of progress. And it's interesting because I think that it's worth kind of thinking about why this is going on, because this isn't just a natural consequence of what's, other things are getting cheaper, but part of the problem is government policy. And if you think about some of the things that have been put in place, things like the policies that have been promoted kind of ironically to help the middle class, things like greater student loan subsidies, access to greater mortgages, have actually helped fuel some of the rising prices in these sectors that have both made the middle class, have pushed these prices up, but then also left people so financially vulnerable. And I think that's one of the other kind of main characteristics when you look at some of these numbers, is that sense that a generation ago, being middle class was in part that meant you were financially secure. You were a worker and you had a solid job, and you owned a house and you were moving along into kind of a steady progress. But now there are so many families out there that are one disaster, one even small financial problem away from a crisis. The most recent numbers I saw had that less than just 50% of people have $1,000 in their checking or savings accounts. And most people, roughly 50% of people, say they live from paycheck to paycheck and aren't putting money away. About a third of Americans are carrying credit card debt and making just the minimum payment on their credit cards. So you think about this, that it's not just that our salaries are stagnating, it's also that there is this kind of financial burden hanging over people. And there's something I think, as part of a women's organization, it's worth kind of noting that it's kind of strange, because you think one of the most notable changes over recent decades has been this incredible increase in women's labor force participation. And you would think that this would be fabulous news for middle-class families who now have two incomes. But kind of ironically, this can add to the feeling of some of the financial vulnerabilities. And it's actually, Elizabeth Warren wrote a book about 20 years ago that was called The Two-Income Trap. And what she kind of highlighted was that families now are making financial decisions based on this idea of having two earners earning their maximum. And a lot of families are going out there, especially chasing good public schools or trying to buy the nicer house to kind of keep up with the Joneses, taking on all this debt. And then they have twice as much problems that, if either mom or dad has to take a pay cut, if either mom or dad loses a job or becomes disabled, this can be financially ruinous. And back when there was one earner and that you got hit with job loss, you at least had two people to start looking for work to replace part of that income. But now, you need both people working at full blast, or else you can create real hardship. So kind of ironically, the stay-at-home mom used to be a financial safety net that increasingly does not exist for both two-earner families as well as for those who are of course, single parents. Then I wanted to just say one other thing, kind of flipping, because I think that if this greater feeling of financial vulnerability and kind of this economics is a part of it. But then I also think that there is this sense of loss and part of the changing economy that is kind of threatening people's positions in society. And I just wanted to highlight one example kind of from my experience. I'm a family from the middle of the country, one of whom ran a small independent pharmacy for years. And this was had about 15, my father-in-law employed about 15 people. Some were earning minimum wage, some had better salaries than that. No one was getting rich, but this was kind of an important little part of this small town. No, nobody's surprised to hear that about 5 years ago that went out of business for the obvious reasons they couldn't compete with Walgreens or Walmart's better efficiency or lower prices. And I've written, but most people in this room have written defending why that's a natural thing and that's a good thing. And Walmart's making people better off by offering cheaper goods and kind of fueling the economy. But there's a real loss to this. And I think if you asked everyone in that store and said, hey, guys, it's okay, you can go get a job at Walmart, actually they're going to pay you 10% more, they would have said, that's not the same thing. This isn't the same. I don't know those people. I don't have any relationship with my customers, and I'm not a part of that kind of community feel. You told them they were going to save $500 because they had access to the trade and all the lower priced goods at Walmart. They would still say, it's not the stuff. It's this idea of having, a community and being a part of something where there was a give and take. So I think there is this kind of, it's not just threatening job loss, there's also this sense of what kind of jobs there was. They don't want to have to wear a uniform or be told you have to say happy holidays and aren't allowed to say Merry Christmas. And this is the kind of thing but you see this throughout some of these small towns. And I think that when you look at kind of what's happened this past year with the kind of frustration with trade and with immigration, which also kind of has a big punch in terms of not only on the job market, but in making things like a lot of public schools where if you have 1 out of every 5 or 1 out of every 8 kids is an English language learner, that makes some of the public schools a lot less appealing to people who were hoping, who really were seeking a good education there. So I think this kind of explains some of the frustrations that we've seen manifest in the support for Trump as he's kind of tapped into that. And I think it's something that conservatives, and if you believe in the free market, we really have to kind of take this anxiety head on and be ready to talk about it. Because saying, no, really, trust me, you're better off. Your household income is $300 more. That's not enough. Prosperity is not defined by money for a lot of these families, and that sense of anxiety is much more tangible than those savings. So that wasn't exactly an upper, but I'll leave there. Pass it on. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Scott. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you to IWF for inviting me to be on this panel. That's my daughter sitting down here. I thought, for a second, I thought she'd come to see Charles speak, and at that point, so glad she's back. And I will try to bring the optimism, because I think we're going to have more of a conversation, I think, about the future and what we might expect in the future. But I think at least the evidence to date about how the middle class has done, I think, provides a lot more evidence for optimism than the conventional wisdom certainly suggests. So there isn't an official definition of the middle class. We have an official poverty line. We don't have anything like an official definition of the middle class. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on trends in the median household, or the median person. The median is the person or household right in the middle, richer than half the population, poorer than half the population. And so I think trends in the middle provide a pretty good way to look at, I think, what's happened in the middle class over time. There's lots of confusion about what's happened to income and earnings over time, because there's some very technical measurement issues involved. So for instance, the Census Bureau, its official trend on median household income shows that between 1979 and 2013, that median household income rose just by 9%. And I should say that's still a $4,000 increase. So it's not the case that incomes have gone down for these folks, even by the Census Bureau numbers. But there are a number of problems with the Census Bureau numbers. For instance, they use a cost of living adjustment that overstate inflation, so that understates how much purchasing power has improved over time. It's pre-tax, so it doesn't take into account the fact that our taxes have gone down, and so the increase in disposable income is actually bigger than that. It doesn't take into account the fact that households have gotten smaller over time, and so $50,000 today is shared among fewer people typically than it was 30, 40 years ago. And it doesn't count healthcare as income at all, whether that's income, whether that's healthcare from the government. More relevant for the middle class, employer-provided healthcare is also not counted, and that's become a bigger and bigger share of compensation over time. Unless employers are getting it badly wrong, and that we all actually would prefer to be getting more pay, there's no reason that we shouldn't be that we should treat healthcare benefits differently than we treat earnings. The Congressional Budget Office has the best figures, which make all these corrections I just mentioned. And they show that from 1979 to 2013, that the median household income rose somewhere between 29% and 47%. So that's from $18,000 to $20,000. Very different than what the Census Bureau figure shows. Even from 2000, it shows an increase of between 7 and 13%, which factors almost $8,000, or as much as $8,000. I think those numbers are probably a little bit high, but nevertheless, they're much closer to the truth, I think, than the Census Bureau figures. Okay, so what's going on? It's not, often present numbers like this and I'll hear, well, what's happening is that wives are being sort of economically coerced into the workforce because guys are doing so badly, and this isn't actually a good thing. Household incomes are going up because it's just wives and mothers who don't want to work but who are forced to, their incomes are going up. Well, there's a lot of problems with that explanation. The first of which is that men's pay growth has slowed over time, but it's not actually fallen over time. So it's not the case that middle-class men are making less than they did in the 1970s and the 1980s. So if you look at median hourly compensation, that's gone up by about 7% between 1979 and 2013, by about 4% since 2000. So not huge figures by any stretch, but it would be very different if those figures were going in the other direction. Second, the increase in work among married women began in the 1940s, well before anybody thinks that men started doing badly. And it went along with other long-term trends like rising educational attainment among women, delayed marriage, reduced fertility. These are trends that are common to industrialized countries around the world, not just to the United States, and that really reflect more economic freedom for women over time. Third, it's not that the fact that the poor and working class women have been increasing how much work. Poor and working class women have always worked. The increase in work among married women has come among the wives of high-income husbands. And so that also suggests this isn't a trend that's about economics. Hours worked among married men has fallen over time, but it hasn't fallen among single men. If we thought this was something common to all guys, you would expect to see it among single men as well. Instead, it might be the case that married men are actually working less, taking it a little bit easier because there's a second earner in the family now. And then finally, male labor force participation, as Charles said, has fallen a lot. But that trend also started in the 1940s. And what's interesting, you can go to the data and these guys who are out of the labor force, working age guys who are not working and not looking for a job, are asked whether they want a job. And it turns out that only about 35 to 40% of those guys say they want a job. Now we might want to talk about that more. It's unclear what they're doing, if they're all getting disability payments. That's a very different explanation than if they're taking care of house or parents or going back to school or things like that. Okay, quickly running out of time, but so my explanation of what we've seen is the demise of a more traditional era when we preferred wives to raise children, and when men were expected ideally to raise a family on one income. And so there was a period where, in effect, working class men received a breadwinner premium in support of this ideal. That is, they were paid, in some sense, above and beyond what their value to the company was, because we all believed as a country that men should raise a family on one income. So you have, what evidence do I have of this? Well, the union's top goal for going back to the 19th century, one of their top goals was to secure a family wage for their members. They actively discriminated against women to restrict competition so their wages weren't pulled down. Hourly pay rose faster than productivity between the years of 1937 and 1948, which you can kind of think of as the years between the Wagner Act that made unionization a lot easier, and the Taft-Hartley Act, which made it tougher. And so essentially what you had was, at some point in 1980, men's pay was above a level that was justified by their value to the company. And meanwhile, married women were working in the workforce more and more. It doesn't make sense to pay a man enough to raise a family on one income if his wife is also working. So the logic of a breadwinner premium breaks down. And you saw men's pay stagnate in the 1980s and the early 1990s, while women's pay rose. But interestingly, since the mid-1990s, men's and women's pay have basically tracked each other, suggesting that there was this correction that happened, which is over now, and the real stagnation that was there, which is in men's pay, was temporary, and essentially that will continue forward. That leaves the question of why there's so much pessimism. I think I've run out of time, so I'll be respectful of that, and hopefully we can come back to that during the Q&A. Thanks.
Well, I'm not a social scientist or an economist in particular. I'm a journalist, so I'm going to give you anecdotes. I'm also going to say this. For all the years that I followed these issues, income and poverty and inequality, and now I think the middle class more than before, we have all, I think, looked to authors like Charles for these kind of global theories. Losing Ground, which was a book that I maybe read the first month I was employed as an opinion writer at a newspaper in Detroit 30 years ago. I bought it wholesale. I thought, okay, sure, this is true. And the other side, therefore, wasn't true. You had your choice. You could go with Charles, and the welfare is destroying the family and the work ethic, or you could go with somebody like William Julius Wilson, and where there were no more jobs for black men who were not educated, who had strong backs but not skills, not mental skills. So of course the families were falling apart. And to me this was something that, not being a social scientist but wondering about it, I thought about that a lot, and I kind of went back and forth for years until it dawned on me one day that these things were both true, which is kind of how I see it now. I think that the answer to all of the questions that we were sent, is this culture, is it economic, is it religious, the answer is yes. I mean, we've got this kind of society where these are all interdependent issues, and for reasons that are, it seems to me, not clear. I will not offer any grand theory, but it seems to me that, yes, when you've got less work or less good work, less well-paying work, families become more fragile. When you've got, I don't know that income supports for 50-year-old men who are fired or whose factory move out of town and they're no longer making a lot of money. I think this is a question we have looked at now for 30 or 40 years, since the early Reagan era, when the Rust Belt started becoming the Rust Belt, we began to see people like auto workers all of a sudden being challenged. We have these people who had who had high school education, sometimes not even, made $40 an hour or $50 an hour with fabulous benefits, best healthcare in the world. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere came Toyota and Honda. And I was working in Detroit in those years, and I don't care about cars. And my only criterion for a car for me personally was it has to be reliable, because I don't care. I don't want to have to deal with this. So of course I bought a Japanese car, and and it was cheaper, and I got a lot of grief for this, but it was, this was part of becoming a free marketeer. These were the Reagan years, you could justify this very easily. And also, the newspaper I worked at, we had this sense of anger toward our blue-collar workers, the auto workers, the unions. We thought they were fat and happy and not competitive and making an inferior product. And as a political matter, I think, these people, there were years of being swing voters. There were, social issues that outweighed some of the economic issues. But these were people who you felt were somehow responsible for what was going on. Dad went into the factory right after high school, and they ended up with a house. Mom didn't work, 2 or 3 kids. They went to really decent schools. And the boys left high school to go into the factories. And the fact that that happened in the 1940s or 50s is one thing, but we saw this going on, I think, in the 80s, at which point you have to say, don't you get it? It's not going to be like this. And they didn't. And those people are in their 50s now and unemployed. So for a long time, I think, this was a class of people who we all, and by we, I mean conservatives, people on the right side of the spectrum, kind of thought, well, you did this to yourself. And, we're for competition, and those cars were no good. And then one day you wake up and realize that it's happening to everybody else. And that really, if you have a global labor market and lots of immigration, everybody's threatened. And labor isn't quite as mobile as we used to like to believe. I mean, people don't just pick up when they're members of the community and they're educated kids and grandma's down the block. And all of a sudden, the picture looks very, very different. And, I guess one is forced to think about that this year because of the Trump phenomenon, which in many ways is long overdue. You've got this class of white, but also not white, also Hispanic and black to some extent, lower skill, formerly higher wage earners who are looking at very bleak futures. And if you're living, really, I cannot imagine that those disability payments are making up for what they earned in jobs. And people who have jobs are, as we keep, I ought to have numbers and I don't, but we keep reading about all of these people who've now got 2 jobs making $10 or $12 an hour. Their lives are very, very different than they were. Their communities are fading. People are moving in. Either you let them stagnate or what? You have to do something. And this is kind of the interesting issue, I think, at the moment, is what is it we are going to do? What would Donald Trump do if he were elected and actually had an answer to this? He kind of mobilized his force. I've never heard a good answer. Worker retraining. That presumes that there are new skills that in your new factory you'll need. So it's, I think this is an ongoing problem. In New York, where I live, I see the class of people who didn't move out of the city, who are working class people, or what we used to call working class people, but they're not now, they're middle income, people like doormen and people who work in moderately small businesses and, go home with $80,000 or $90,000 a year, which is not a million, that's, should be worth more than it is. And their kids are falling apart if you don't have education and you're not kind of upwardly mobile. The idea that you can stay at that level for a couple of generations, I think, is gone. I mean, I think that I talk to people who come from 5 generations of kind of Irish or Italian or some combination of, working class people who did really well. And they've got, they're on their second divorce, and they've got a kid who is a drug addict, and another kid whose marriage just fell apart, and maybe they're going to have to take the grandchild in. These stories that used to be outliers, I think, have become much, much more common. So I don't know. I think we're kind of in a funny situation, and I don't see where it goes. I don't see how you retrain a whole class of people who are neither exceptionally intelligent nor content with with absolute menial labor. So there you are. I mean, it's a problem. Charles mentioned the problem of artificial intelligence and a future with fewer jobs. So, I have listened to many people talk about this, and it is very clear that things are going to change in ways that we don't, it doesn't look like anything we've ever seen before. And to me, the problem is not merely how people are going to earn money, because we'll figure that one out, but it's what people are going to do, how you have a society where people have so much leisure. Not everybody needs as much leisure as one thinks one wants. People like to get up and go to work. And a society where people work 20 hours a week and jobs are split. And it's very easy, I think, to ratchet back the way the middle class in this country did for the last 8 years after the recession, where people cut back on spending, gave up a lot of things. What's not easy is to imagine setting up a whole different paradigm for life where work isn't one of the central components. So, I don't know, I guess I'm a pessimist. But I do sort of think we muddle on. I mean, in people's children, you're not going to solve a problem for a generation, you'll solve it for their children. But there you are.
Well, actually, I think that's a good spot to start the question and answer, because, is that working? It's hard for me to tell sometimes. I was thinking about it can be a little bit overwhelming when you think about automation and you think about the cultural changes and sort of all of this is one, but if you start to pull things apart and think of them in discrete pieces, there's things that we can do. And so, I live in Arlington, right over the river, and we have a few children, and I would like to have a bigger house, and it's very expensive, and it's expensive obviously because we live in a relatively safe area, and there's lots of government jobs, they don't go away. There's lots of jobs, and there's new restaurants and all of that. But the other reason that it's very expensive is sort of, as Carrie pointed out, so government has gotten in the way. We have all these affordable housing efforts that are intended to bring sort of people who are working sort of quote middle-class jobs closer into the city. But obviously it's sort of collapsing supply, and it's driving up costs, and it's making it so that my husband and I have to have a 2-income family in order to have our house now and to hopefully have a bigger house at some point. And so I think that when we think about sort of addressing this issue, one piece of that is sort of rolling back some of the government that's gotten in the way. And so I thought maybe, Carrie, you might want to start by responding to that, because I think that those are some discrete things that we can say, hey, we have to sort of halt things before we move forward.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that if there is going to be an optimistic message, is I do think that there are things we can do to try to help facilitate job creation and certainly make some things that are right now unnecessarily expensive more affordable. Housing being one of them, because there's interesting studies on on how some of the urban planning ends up just tremendously driving up prices in places like Portland, where they've created kind of strict regulations and boundaries for where you're allowed to build and exactly how things build. The prices of housing go up and really end up, again, it's not just pricing people out of certain areas, but it's also just creating this tremendous financial pressure. So I do think that, it's interesting to kind of linger on this, what this lack of jobs means and kind of what that means more, not only as an income problem, but as a cultural problem. But at least on the other side of the ledger, getting government out of the way and kind of, if you look at food prices, again, I haven't lived in America really for 8 years, and I think y'all should be shocked about how expensive groceries are. When I left in 2008, I remember being surprised at how expensive groceries were in Austria. Coming back 8 years later, the prices are so much higher here, almost across the board, than they are in Europe. Things like meat and bread. It's the I think that the food inflation here. I don't think these numbers are true when we hear
Everything is $4.
when we hear when we hear about some of the inflation costs. It's one of those things where I wonder what's going on with some of the statistics, because it's one of those things where who do you believe, your lying eyes or what they're telling you, because there's absolutely, when it comes to things like groceries, I know gas is an outlier, but anyway, but I think that there are things, and we can at least hope that if we had more sensible and rational policies that didn't make these problems work, that would at least help on some level.
Yeah, I can open it up, so go ahead.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Chris Rugaber. I'm the reporter at AP. I wanted to run by a couple of things I hear about on these issues from perhaps certainly different perspectives, and just get a sense of what your guys, all of your responses are. I mean, one thing I hear a lot of, or occasionally, is the idea that, frankly, the manufacturing jobs that we all miss and talk about were not always necessarily so great. They were, in fact, initially sort of dirty and dangerous and Dickensian, and some, from different points of view, perhaps argue that a combination of unions and government came in and made these jobs better than they might have been otherwise. And correspondingly, is there something we can do about, say, some of the service jobs, not necessarily government, but union or others, to, for example, home health aides, one of the fastest growing categories. Could those people be given more skills and therefore be able to command more income? Is there, and on a related note, as we went from agriculture to manufacturing, there was a big increase in the proportion of people we sent to high school. As we go from manufacturing and continue to move into information age, should we be looking similarly to upgrade skill levels, and not necessarily with four-year college, which gets into some of the subsidy issues, but a greater use of what used to be called vocational education. There are apparently some middle-income jobs in healthcare and so forth that pay decent wages but don't require a four-year degree, and those are the ones that a lot of employers say they have trouble finding folks. So I guess those two approaches, if just interested in what anyone's taking.
I just want to
those are
say,
worth trying.
I haven't heard anybody in years say that we shouldn't, we all know we need more vocational education. Everybody knows that. And the last the last 15 years where we've had these wars, and we've been shuffling mostly boys, but also, women, young women, through the military, you see a lot of people come out with real skills. People who otherwise wouldn't have had them. They would have, they get out of high school, and they might have, who knows what they would have done. Go to the military, they learn how to do things, and they end up with a great work ethic. I have seen many, many people from that background then go on and work for contractors, or become plumbers, become electricians, and end up, making $100,000 a year. So I think that's a great thing to do. The home health aid thing is a problem because you've got a market, and the market is people who are paying for health care, usually for a parent, an aging parent. And you can help these people get better skills, but it's very unclear where the money's going to come from on the other end to pay for a better health care aid.
Well, if you're talking about, say, using unions or some other mechanism, or government to something like the healthcare aides, or for that matter, nannies or others, it raises a very broad issue whereby when you hire a nanny or you hire a healthcare person, what do you want above all? You want a conscientious person who will do the right thing even though no one is looking over its shoulder. Okay. Now, you also want them to be kind and nurturing and loving, but you really want the conscientiousness part. Unions are real good at, in some respects, with when you have a large workforce and you have assembly lines and you have routinization of things. Unions are real bad, I think, at, okay, just let me ask you. If you're going to hire a health care aide for your aging parent, would you hire one from a union, or would you hire one that you have interviewed and that you have chosen and that you have control over, or one that's going to follow the union rules? And I think it's an illustration of how ill-suited a lot of traditional mechanisms are to this. However, having said that, I also think that the great thing we have to face is that we need to understand that the nature of today's economy is inherently going to provide the bigger rewards, much bigger proportionally than they were a century ago, to the people who are lucky enough to be in the very top percentiles of ability. And they are going to continue to make out like bandits, as they have been doing for a long time. There will continue to be jobs that only they can do, that artificial intelligence can't do. They're going to be worth a lot of money. We've got to come up with ways to raise the floor. I say this is a self-identified libertarian. And I think that one of the things that libertarians have to come to grips with is the degree to which we are facing a situation in which people who are lucky enough to have one certain skill set, the skill set that goes under the label called IQ, through no fault of their own, through no virtue of their own, that failure to have that one particular skill set in a very lavish quantity should not mean that you take the wage that the market provides. I think as a society, we have to rethink a basic income, which is my own solution, or some other ways of augmenting wages above market rates. And what I have just said is so heretical with regard to that I've worried for myself walking home.
Charles, maybe I could just respond to you really quick. I feel like one area where I've heard people sort of discuss this is that it's a two-way street, right? So while the right very often says, well, absolutely we can't raise the minimum wage, it'll just push, create a barrier to entry and it'll push people out of the workforce. But what if we came to the middle, and they would argue and say, we'll raise the minimum wage, but we'll also lower the corporate tax rate that those businesses could afford to sort of lift the wages of all people. Is that crazy for us to be thinking about as conservative libertarians? Something that would, in effect, grow government in order to help people.
But something I think that Charles is making an interesting point, in that the kind of divorcing the idea of the basic income from the wage itself. Because in some ways, I think that I would still say that raising the minimum wage is a bad idea because it will destroy jobs and it'll lead to less work opportunities. And I think that there's virtue in work beyond the money you take. So I can see, and I think that it is, interesting to think about how government can provide that floor, but without changing those economic incentives that still have those starter jobs. So you're earning $15 an hour and showing up and earning $10 an hour and learning how to work the cash register and be polite and all those other things. So I don't think that you necessarily have to choose between the two.
Hi, I'm Sharon, the bad voice of the moderate. I've got a question because I was raised upper middle class. I love that lifestyle. My mother had great advisors. She was able to get long-term health care insurance. I mean, you talk about the healthcare workers. Now she has Alzheimer's. Her care is over $600 a day. The insurance, after we paid a $90,000 deductible, the insurance is kicked in. Now, I still am comfortable that I live now a very middle-class lifestyle, maybe between $60,000 and $70,000 a year, and I cannot afford long-term health care insurance. So I'm going to go from living in the upper middle class to doing as much as I could for my country to, if I get Alzheimer's, I'm going to be beholden to whatever the government gives me. And the Obamacare has forced me, because I'm 52 years old, my premiums are $863 a month. With the deductible, it's $16,000 out of pocket before I pay taxes. So I will be part of the 47% for the first time in my life because of Obamacare. And a lot of my friends are very frustrated, and they almost blame Fred Thompson because they can't afford homes, because with the reverse mortgage, it used to be that the estate, right, would go and you would use that money not to like live a frivolous life, but to like buy a house. And so now we see these home prices go up, but there's not that generational, gift of a down payment. So I think we have to look at everything as a whole and understand that we really hurt. And I love my family, and my family was great, and they set me up. But well, he's gone, so I've got to prevent that.
I just want to say, when we talk about the middle class, mostly we think about the people Charles writes about, and about really middle income people across the country. But the upper middle class is part of the middle, under tremendous stress. I mean, that is, and stress not because life is so hard, but because the idea that your children are not going to live as well as you, or that they may not. The upper middle class are the people who've invented things like helicopter parenting and obsessive SAT preparation from the age of 4. Because life has gotten so much more competitive, and all of these global influences, bringing in smart immigrants, and we have lots of unintelligent immigrants, we have lots of intelligent immigrants. We have all these people from China who come and take slots at universities. So the average 18-year-old, I think, in this kind of I-95 corridor from Washington to Boston, who's a child of 2 professionals, both of whom have 2 degrees from good schools. That's a kid who's going to have a really tough time getting into college, because unless you are at the tippy top of that. So I think that is a fragile place. And I think it's unpleasant and stressful for, I think, lots of people in that part of the middle class. And it's not like you're going to cry for people who are doing pretty well, but it is a weird thing to have set up that the idea of a meritocracy that can't replicate itself is a little bit funny, especially when we've got the 001% that really does replicate itself, that will buy its way into any institution and any position. So, and there's a place where I think that having a very high IQ, not maybe the highest, but certainly, really solid, it doesn't get you as much as it could.
So first of all, really sorry to hear about your situation. I have parents who are getting older every day, so really feel for you. I'd say that to preface, I do think there's a danger in sort of extrapolating our individual situations, any of us, towards everybody else, right? So just a few stats on mobility. There's a survey called the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth that started looking at kids in their teens in the late 1970s and has followed them, continues to follow them today. So today they're about 45, they're about my age. If you look at the median income of the 45-year-olds versus the median income of all their parents, that went up by about 39%, so about consistent with the numbers I gave you before. If you ask instead, what was the median change that a kid experienced relative to their own parents? So you compare their income to their own parents' income, figure out what the change is, and what was the one in the middle? 93% increase in their income. And that sounds incompatible with the 39%, but the way to square it is that there are a lot of people who, growing up, doubling their parents' income, their parents were poor enough that it leaves them still middle class or below middle class. And so you have a lot of people moving up, and you do have downward mobility as well. I think a phenomenon among a lot of my peers in the think tank world who've generally done pretty well for ourselves is that we're concerned about our kids not doing as well, and to some extent there's a thing called regression to the mean, which suggests they're more likely to do worse than us than they are to do better than us because we did pretty well. And so there is a lot of mobility in the world. I think every generation, people tell themselves this is the first generation that's going to do worse than their parents did, and I don't think that ever ends up actually being true. I think we continue to experience improvements relative to parents as a whole. And I think the stats bear that out.
I want to ask you a question.
No, go ahead.
Do you think that the post-war boom, where so many more people came into higher education and there was so much more opportunity, do you think that's kind of a unique experience that that had great benefits that are not going to be replicated?
Not necessarily. So if you look at trends in intergenerational mobility, for instance, if you start in the bottom, do you have a good chance to make it to the middle? If you start in the middle, do you fall down or go up? If you start in the top, do you have a good chance of staying at the top? The research is pretty consistent that intergenerational mobility has not worsened over time. Now, you read Charles's book, and so we know what today's 45-year-olds, what happened to them, right? We don't know what today's 5-year-olds are going to have experienced, and there are some reasons to think maybe things will be different this time, and our 5-year-olds will have worse mobility than everyone has had for 50 years. Possible. It's in the future, so we can't predict it. But I think there are trends to go along with some of the pessimistic trends as well that point towards being optimistic. Parental education is higher, exposure to lead is lower, discrimination is lower, teen pregnancy is down, unwanted births are down, healthcare coverage is up, class sizes are up. So there are, and that's not at all to shrug off the very worrisome trends that Charles documents, but I think it's we should make strong statements, I guess, about what the future will look like, I guess.
Thank you, Carolyn Harvey-Lundberg, and I appreciate all of your comments. I think you're touching on one of the really large elephants in the room for those of us who are baby boomers who are dealing with aging and ailing parents. And speaking as someone who worked at HHS for probably too long, I think we can't get away from the issue and the real financial burden that's being presented by the healthcare costs. And I'm hearing people dance around that, and you correctly talked about healthcare benefits as being an important part of income. Well, that's disappearing because with Obamacare and its progeny and all the rest of what's been going on, a lot of businesses are realizing that they can't afford, nor probably do they have to afford now to provide that kind of coverage because it's all going to be in the exchanges, which aren't really available now. So we're having the one disaster away that you refer to for many families is the healthcare disaster. So where do you see that taking us in as the middle class is becoming increasingly burdened by costs?
I'll tell you what I see among people I live around who can't pay who don't have good long-term insurance or who can't pay for private care. In New York City, which is a socialist wonderland, you get you're a free, I guess, Medicaid paid for individual provider. The goal is to keep people in their homes because nobody wants public nursing homes, which are almost always a disaster. So the city seems to provide this, often 24/7 for years on end to many, many families. We're at a funny place with medicine where our medicine is good enough to keep people alive longer than it used to, but a lot of times we have people living way past their ability to function, and those are the years that have to get paid for. And I presume this is something we will transition through. I hope it is. It's not going to work for our generation. Right. So, I don't know.
Yeah, question to follow up on some of Charles's remarks, excellent remarks, by the way. You're right that exponential technologies, especially AI, and I'd add biohacking, by the way, are finally catching up to their reputations. But unlike in the past, where there were many, many decades that an economy could adjust, with exponential change, it means it's only a decade or even a few years. So my question is kind of twofold. Number one, in your book on education, you suggest that too many people are going to college, probably true, and as you suggest that the future depends on how we educate that top 1%. And I wanted to ask a little bit first about that education. To what extent is it a moral education, a skill education, et cetera? And second, because all of you have pointed out the problem of what happens with the economy and the need for adjustment, which libertarians haven't really addressed, Marx had the same sort of issue when he said the rich would get, with machines and technology, the rich would get richer and richer, there'd be fewer of them, the poor would get poorer and poorer, there would be many more of them, and that's where the revolution came. Marx never asked, who is going to buy all that stuff that these factories are producing? Now they're producing 10 times as many sweaters with half the workers, and they cut the wages of the other half for the workers. Marx never asked that question about labor markets. Do you see a similar issue coming up with the top 1% producing incredible miracles and technological stuff? Will the labor markets adjust?
Well, first let me go to how should we educate the very top of the pile. That book is kind of bifurcated. On the one hand, I dump on college as way overinflated in terms of its value, and I want to substitute for it certifications that you might get in 1 year, 1.5 years, 2 years, and get rid of the BA. So I'm very anti-college in a lot of ways. These kids who are going to run the world eventually, and the ones who get into the very tippy top schools, to put it nicely, they should get a very rigorous, demanding classical education. Put less elegantly, that education should be one which grabs them by the scruff of the neck and humiliates them in terms of teaching them that there are some things they aren't smart enough to do, that they aren't good enough to do, because a lot of them have never experienced failure before. They should really take on something that the elite schools used to do quite consciously, and that is to say, boy, are you lucky, through no fault of your own, and with that luck goes enormous burdens. And here are the burdens, and here are why you're morally obligated to do this. So when I say the future depends on the top 1%, I do not add to that those sweet little darlings, those over-pampered, over-helicoptered, and completely oblivious to how lucky they are kids. They have to have their feet held to the fire. With regard to the second part, the degree of wealth that we have generated as a nation is so far beyond anything that Marx could ever envision, that we are now in the position of saying that the wealth is so much that for the first time in human history, you can end poverty. That was not possible until a couple of decades ago in any country. I mean, we're talking about a very recent phenomenon. And so Marx never had the option of saying, we can have rich people, but we can also have no poor people. And we do have that option now, and we still have yet to figure out how to do it.
Well, you mentioned inflation. My indicator was the price of scotch. But I don't know whether this was brought up because I was late getting here, but the absolutely deleterious effect of the scam of H-1B visas, bringing foreigners in, firing Americans, Caterpillar, Disney, a whole slew of them, and the effect of that on a man who's middle-aged was not going to get another job, maybe bagging if he's lucky. Would you address the effect of H-1B on family and income?
I don't know the nomenclature. Is that for high skill?
Yes. These are all skilled people, especially the IT industry.
Well, I'm afraid here that I'm in favor of experimenting with virtual ban on low-skill immigration. And I say if you're smart enough to be a senior executive at Disney, you better be able to put up with the competition. I think that the high-skill immigration that's something where I'm quite confident that's going to create far more wealth than it destroys. It's going to create more jobs than it destroys, because these are the people who do still create jobs with the innovations they bring. So no, I'm a big fan of high-skill immigration.
Well, this isn't really immigration. This is bringing people over on visas. A lot of them from India, and Hillary Clinton was tied up with this, to deliberately displace Americans so they can pay lower wages. These people are not on the citizenship track.
Well, I'm not familiar at all with this program, so I
Yeah,
can't
it's
understand that.
really a form of cheap exploited labor that puts skilled Americans on the dole.
Completely unfamiliar.
There's someone all the way.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was kind of, I misunderstood a lot of what you said, but my question was, what can you guys speak to, maybe someone already covered it, about single women in the military and where they're going with the economic, development, international or local?
Single women in the military in particular, I don't know if anyone.
Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, no, I don't think we have talked about it. I think that it's interesting to see the kind of the rising role of single women as kind of an economic force. There are a growing number of female breadwinners, and the jobs in the military, we focus a lot. There's when IWF actually hosted a debate on women in combat, but where that's contentious, I think that it's great that there are so many opportunities for women in the military. Now, outside of the combat role, but I don't know about any specific concerns about kind of how that changes anything. There's obviously been, as part of the legacy of discrimination that's gone away, that women are in so many more leadership positions in terms of in service. So.
And I only brought that up because I thought maybe people were targeting single women in the military as a way to grow a middle class anywhere.
Are you thinking about single mothers who, there's a population of single mothers who,
help the middle class as opposed to destroy it, or I guess my question really is, are single women in the military helping make the middle class a success or make it a failure?
Maybe we could ask you.
Yeah,
I think the answer is they may in fact make their own lives more successful, but I don't think it has much of an effect in general.
But you can't generically group single women in the military as a problem to the middle class.
No, I don't think we would say that. I don't think that anybody would say that that's a particular concern. I think there's obviously the single parents and the rise in single parents is a kind of an interesting issue across the board, and it has brought a lot of different challenges. But I don't think we could single out women in the military.
I think you could certainly make a better case for single women in the military than for married women in the military. But that's a different debate.
Charlotte, why don't you?
Scott, the 5-minute rule, because of it, you got cut off sort of in medias res. And so you said maybe we could talk about why, if things are better as you think they are, there's so much anxiety and pessimism now. So I've been sitting here wondering.
My own interpretation, that others may feel differently. I think first of all, there are a lot of different institutions that have incentives to play up the negative. So media, I think, being the most obvious one. If it bleeds, it leads, right? No one wants to read a newspaper article that says things basically like they used to be, right? But it's more than just media. It's sort of think tanks and foundations. A lot of people who are in public policy are trying to make the world a better place. That presumes there are big problems that need to be fixed, and so I think we tend to play up the big problems. Politicians, I've learned this over time. I used to be quite liberal and have been on the conservative side for, 4 or 5 years now, I guess. It took me a while to realize that for me to tell a Republican member of Congress that things are actually better than what your constituents think. Like, politicians can't make that speech, right? They can't you know what? Things are actually a lot better than what you guys think. Vote for me. So I think that's a big part of it. And I think secondarily, as a consequence of this quiet revolution of married women working more, I think you have a group of working class men who feel, even though their absolute position hasn't deteriorated, I argue, their relative position certainly has, right? So they no longer rule the roost in the same way that they did in the 60s or whatever. White men relative to minorities, to immigrants, their relative position has probably deteriorated a little bit. So I think in the working class, you do have this sense, this sort of politics of nostalgia, which I think is a big part of the Trump phenomenon. There was this great survey where they asked people, when was America great? Make America great again. And Trump voters said the 1950s was the most common response given. And I think that speaks to the sense that there was a time where where people felt more comfortable about the world. And then because there are more two-worker families, I think to some extent the middle class and upper middle class hasn't really come to terms with the trade-offs involved in that change. I think it's a great thing that married women have more economic freedom today. I have a daughter, so I want her to do whatever she wants to do when she grows up. But there are trade-offs, right? You have to pay for childcare. You get this time crunch stuff that a lot of Hillary Clinton's advisors are talking about. And it feels like it's tougher these days. But these are trade-offs. You know, people could try to have the 1970s living standards with one earner. But none of us want a 1970s living standard, right? And it would actually be hard to do these days as well. You have to find a house that's basically what a middle-class family lived in 1970. I don't know where you would even find that these days.
Well, split levels in Arlington. All over the place. Go ahead. I have one last question to close this out, so I'll let
So I've been sitting here for a long time trying to come up with a question, just because of my background and experiences. There's a lot of things that have been said across the panel that I can agree with. The one thing I think I finally settled on is, I read an article recently that referred to this Trump phenomenon being more of a rural thing. We've seen a lot of rural communities strongly back Trump, even those that openly acknowledge that yes, he said things that are very inappropriate, but we're still going to support him because of X, Y, and Z, and he refers to more economic issues. This is where a lot of people side with him. Is there some way you could get students that parents are top 1% to acknowledge that, hey, maybe it wouldn't be a bad idea for me to go to vocational school just because? Is there a way you could set up a program to get those students to go to a vocational program and get students from rural schools to go to a four-year university? Maybe flip this on its head. Give people different opportunities. Is there any way you could conceive of a program, of a speech, anything where you could give this idea of flipping this on the head and giving people different experiences that they've just never had?
Parents can do that, government can't. Particularly when you're talking about getting kids from privileged families to consider anything except going to college and then to law school and then get an MBA and so forth. And I've done my bit by writing a book called Curmudgeon's Guide to Getting Ahead, in which I urge kids who I say have reached the age of 18 with all the resilience of crystal champagne flutes to not go to college and instead go to the military or get the hell out of the labor force for a year or two. And aside from writing books and lecturing to your children, don't let the government get into this.
But actually, I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that I feel like we are seeing a change in the conversation about college. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but I know that there's something where most recent graduates think that their education is not worth it, and I think that there's a lot of people who are starting to look at costs and think, $80,000 for, a 4 year. I think that we are reaching a moment where we're starting to have these conversations, and it's interesting because there are different models. In a place like I recently lived in Germany, and it is not. There are the vocational and the kind of the tracks there where kids go not to university but to like skilled programs. There's no stigma to it, or certainly there's not much of a stigma to it. I'm sure that there's still you'd rather say you're going to the Ivy League or the most important, prestigious schools, but it's an entirely respectable and well-considered decision to go into these tracks. So I do think that just having conversations about it and talking about where the future goes, and I think part of these economic realities, as jobs start to go away, that we are going to have to be. The education system is going to respond. I feel this is one area. If there's an area for optimism, I do think that I think that in 10 years our college system is going to become more focused on providing value because there is this, at some point people aren't going to. It doesn't make any sense to be taking out $50,000 loans for a year at a college where you take an art history class and come out with no skills. And I think a lot of parents are going to start reconsidering that. And this is going to be an ongoing conversation. We can win this one without government.
Yeah, I agree. I think market forces are really going to transform education.
Yeah.
I encourage people, we still have our little wine bar set up, and I think that the speakers will be able to be here for a few minutes to mingle and to ask a few more questions, and we'll let those of you who need to depart for the evening Say good night. So thank you all so much for coming.
Oh my goodness, okay, yeah. I really appreciate
Very good seeing you.